You know, one of the worst cliches that you can perform on a stage like this is to say, General Pטראוס needs no introduction, and then proceed with 5 minutes of introducing his very rich career. But I'd like to say beyond the formal positions that were mentioned, two facts. One is that his reputation was enhanced dramatically when he commanded in Iraq and was able to defeat the Sunni insurrection through a combined strategy of military moves and alliances with the tribes that had a dramatic effect on the state of affairs in Iraq. And secondly, he has a PhD from Princeton. He also likes to study and to write, and we'll come back to that a little later in our conversation. So, and finally, he's a friend of the INSS. This is one of the many conferences that he has attended, and hopefully will also do the same in future events. Let me begin by asking you about something that has been a main motive of the discussions until now this morning. Iran's role, the conflict with Iran, the specific American-Iranian conflict. We came quite close to a direct confrontation between the United States and Iran. This, of course, is a story that goes back to 1979, went through ups and downs, but the relationship has never been sorted now. It's now been aggravated. So can you share with us your perspective on this issue?
Well, first of all, Ambassador, thanks very much. Thanks for the kind words. It's great to be back here. I must say, I think it's particularly important to be here as an American because there are not many Americans here this year, sadly. As I came through the airport the other morning, I've never seen it as deserted, and it reminded me, I think, how important it is actually to be here. And to INSS, congratulations on yet another great conference. Frank, thanks for all you have done over the years to enable all of this to happen. It's great to be back in this cozy little bedroom again one more time. Your question really, Ambassador, I think causes us to reflect a little bit on the role of the United States and the presence of the United States in the Middle East. And that led me to remember three, we used to call them CENTCOM truths, Central Command realities, if you will. And the first of those was, in the Middle East, never forget who your enemies are and who your friends are. Israel is our friend. Iran is indeed our enemy. It has been, as you noted, since 1979. It is implacable, and it is still the case. Second is that Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens here doesn't stay here. Rather, it tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and in some cases, a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into Europe and sometimes all the way to the United States. And the third is that the U.S. trying to leave the Middle East is like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. And by the way, Fareed Zakaria stole that the other day and put it in a column. He did not footnote it. I'm going to get after him. But again, you just keep getting sucked back in. And it's far better, I think, just to recognize that that is a reality. And this causes me to recall my sense at the time when the pivot to Asia was announced. And I thought, first of all, the term pivot is a terrible term because it implies swinging away from one to the other. The much better term, which was used, to be fair as well, by those that were a bit more nuanced, was rebalance to Asia. Clearly, there did need to be more emphasis, more focus, more resources in the Indo-Pacific region, as it is now called, and a reduction of that in the Middle East. But the pivot, I think, really scared some of our partners and friends in the region, and it was overdone. I think the current circumstances, what's happened on 10/7 and since then, is a very stark reminder that these three realities that I just recalled are still present, and that the presence of the United States in the region is absolutely imperative. You ask about Iran. I think that Iran does not want to get into a direct fight with the U.S. The U.S. does not want to get in a direct fight with Iran. But at some point in time, probably after the election, this is an election year in the United States after all, and there's a reluctance, I think, to take certain actions, including sanctions, that could, for example, result in higher gasoline prices at the pump in the United States in an election year and so forth. You're not going to see those kinds of actions, but I think we need to revisit those very quickly in late November of this year. That is, again, I think, the reality here. We have seen, actually, the Iranians, the IRGC Quds Force, went to their proxies in Iraq after the U.S. unleashed its power against them and said, tone this down, and I think there have been very, very few attacks since then. The Houthis really don't necessarily respond to Iranian direction, as one of the panels rightly noted. The Zaidi don't have the same allegiance to the supreme leader in Tehran the way that Hezbollah and those in Iraq do. And we should note, this is their Saladin moment. They are fighting against the Crusaders. They're on the stage, the main stage, for the first time. And it is much more complex even than was described here, because the Saudis brokered a ceasefire. They don't want that to fall apart. That's one of the reasons why they and others have not joined this maritime coalition. I think over time, the U.S. gradually is going to degrade. It's going to grind down. It's disrupting their ability, and that at some point in time, if we're able to also to cut off the reinforcements, the resupplies, the rearming, and so forth that is provided by Iran, that we can reduce that threat and the traffic can go back up. I should just note as a footnote, coming on the end of the group that was here before, the impact on the global economy, and of course, as the chairman of the KKR Global Institute, this is what we look at. The impact on the global economy of what's going on in the Middle East is actually not all that significant, other than the loss of 60% of the revenue that Egypt gets from transit of the Suez Canal. And that is not trivial for Egypt, given the fragility of its economy right now. But otherwise, there's been no effect on global energy markets. Yes, it costs a bit longer in time, and also fuel costs to go 10 to 14 days extra around Africa, depending on where you're going in Europe. But that is not a significant change, not significant in markets. What would be significant would be if freedom of navigation in the Gulf was disrupted. But Iran doesn't want that disrupted either, because they are actually being allowed to export about 1.7, 1.8 million barrels of crude oil a day out through the Gulf as well. So again, in overall terms, again, not in the micro terms of what these conflicts are doing, which is very, very serious indeed, but in overall terms, the impact on the global economy is not that significant.
Thank you. When the term pivot away from the Middle East was introduced into the conversation, somebody quipped that if you do not visit the Middle East will visit you. Yeah. When you were head of CENTCOM, you testified, I believe, in Congress, and you sort of complained that you cannot begin a conversation in Saudi Arabia without hearing initially a complaint about the Palestinian issue.
That was issue number 1, 2, and 3. When I would see the king in Saudi Arabia, again, keep in mind this is 13 to 15 years ago or so, perhaps a bit longer. Issue number 1, 2, and 3 was the Palestinian issue. And then over time, in subsequent years, and then when I would go back as a CIA director, and then even subsequent to that in other capacities, that issue fell off the plate, although I submit that it is back in the plate right now.
To the point of discussing normalization currently. So normalization would be a pivotal point in trying to construct this pro-American, pro-Western coalition with Saudi Arabia, several Arab states, and Israel. Do you see that as really feasible? Let's assume for a moment that the Palestinian obstacle is removed and the road is open. How effective could such a coalition be?
Well, I learned as a young infantryman, a paratrooper, that when you confront a minefield, you should go around it rather than through it. And that's where I'm about to get into Israeli domestic politics. And as you know, given the current coalition, I think that's just not a feasible objective. But if those politics change, I think it's a very feasible objective. And again, as one who still sees no alternative to 2 states for 2 peoples, which I know the support for that is down, but again, show me any other possible resolution to this issue. As long as that is the least bad idea, I think that, again, the idea that the U.S. is putting forward together with the Saudis and certainly the Emiratis, Bahrainis, and others is something that has to be considered. And frankly, once Hamas is destroyed, and I am one of those who believes that Hamas does have to be destroyed, and destruction, by the way, the military doctrinal term for Hamas, for destruction, is to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. Keep your eye on without reconstitution, because right now I'm not sure I see how that is going to be accomplished. That's one of the issues with which the War Cabinet is very much wrestling. And I should note, with great respect and admiration, I had a very good meeting, nearly an hour yesterday, with the Minister of Defense and his Director General, and then met with one of his Director for Policy this morning. They're keenly aware of the challenges, the issues, all this stuff. They're wrestling with them. But I think that I do believe, and Benny Gantz, I thought, put it very well in Washington yesterday, you don't send the fire department to put out 80% of the fire. You send it to extinguish the entire blaze. And I know the challenges that lie ahead. We learned the hard way in Iraq. Keep in mind, I was there as a 2-star, 3-star, and 4-star. You kindly noted what we did during the surge in Iraq. Nowhere near as fiendishly difficult as Gaza is. Nowhere near as large an enemy in aggregate. Nowhere near the tunnels, the subterranean knowledge of the neighborhoods, all of this, the support of the people, but still the concepts of clearing an area and holding the area, not just going on to the next area, and ensuring that you separate the people from the extremists. Because I see Hamas as the equivalent of the Islamic State. They are not reconcilable, by and large. There may be some here and there, and certainly the bureaucrats, that you can deal with that. But you've got to secure the people, you've got to clear an area of Hamas and its infrastructure and so forth. You've got to be sure that, again, quite sure that they're out of it, the explosives, et cetera, the infrastructure destroyed. And then you've got to secure them. And the way we did that in cities like Fallujah, Ramadi, and some of the others is we created what we call gated communities. We used to say to them, you know, you spend a lot of money for a gated community in Florida, and we're going to give it to you for free here in Fallujah. But you do have to have a biometric ID card to get in and out, and that's how you keep it secure. Those kinds of tactics, techniques, and procedures are certainly being considered. I think that those are going to have to be implemented. And I must say that what I do agree with my country's government on is the absolute imperative of providing urgent humanitarian assistance to the people in Gaza. And there has to be a commitment, the trauma that Israel has sustained notwithstanding. And I try to put this into perspective for Americans. Keep in mind that we lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks. This was the equivalent of the U.S. losing 42,000 and having 7,000 taken hostage. So this is, again, way, orders of magnitude. People say this is Israel's 9/11. It's much, much worse than that. But that notwithstanding, there has to be a commitment to provide a better life for the Palestinian people in Gaza, and I would submit in the West Bank as well. But focus on Gaza, get the humanitarian assistance in there, into the areas especially where Hamas has been cleared, and keep Hamas out of those areas. It is possible to do that, but it obviously implies the need for the IDF and perhaps some other assistance as you are developing local supporters, it would be too strong a term, but local assistance on the ground inside Gaza. You've got to get that into the people, but then separate them from Hamas and demonstrate that the hospitals are going to function, there's going to be reconstruction, basic services will be restored, in addition to just desperately needed humanitarian assistance.
Thank you. Now, I want to mention that you are most recently the author of Conflict, a book on war and warfare at the present. And from that perspective, and based on your rich experience, how do you see the military aspects of the war that we are still conducting in Gaza?
Well, so this is a book titled Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. It was, yes, a New York Times bestseller, not bad for military history. It was co-authored with Andrew Roberts, this is the great British historian and biographer. This is his 20th book, but the first for which he had a co-author. What we're seeing in many, many respects is the advent of all kinds of new technology. And it's starting to really proliferate. You see it in Ukraine as well. You're seeing, actually Ukraine is interesting because you actually have a war that's almost like World War I with trenches and barbed wire and massive quantities of artillery and so forth. You have Cold War era tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and other weapon systems, and then you have modern drones over top all of it. And the great Washington Post columnist Max Boot has described the Ukraine war as the one in which All Quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner, the book about World War I, obviously, and then a book about the future. And the future of war, to describe where it's going, I think is interesting, and then we can back up and see where it is right now. But the future is going to be one in which small numbers of large platforms, especially if you look at, say, the Indo-Pacific region or even ground combat, we're talking about aircraft carriers, major ships, tanks, F-35s, and so forth. They're going to be gradually replaced by massive quantities of unmanned systems. Keep in mind the small number of large platforms, they're incredibly capable, but they're also heavily manned, they're inordinately expensive, and they're very increasingly vulnerable. So they're going to give way over time to a massive quantity of much smaller unmanned systems, which increasingly are not going to be remotely piloted, they're going to be algorithmically driven. And we're seeing some of this already. So the man in the loop, the person in the loop, is going to be the person on the loop, the person who actually designs the algorithm, the software, determines the conditions the machine meets, and the machine is constantly enabled further by artificial intelligence and machine learning. And it's going to be, over time, machine against machine. We're far from that right now, but you're starting to see some of this come onto the battlefield here. The use of facial recognition and other different technologies, biometric and so forth, is already helping Israel enormously, because you've very expertly taken all the footage of these horrific, barbaric, inhuman actions on 10/7, gathered it together, mined it for, again, facial recognition and other biometric signatures, and now applying that. And that's how you can tell, when you have a massive number of civilians, who are the bad guys in this group and who are not. So again, we're seeing this rapid advance, but at the end of the day, there still has to be a soldier, maybe after a machine goes in first, but a soldier, on the ground, boots on the ground, who goes in and clears every building, every floor, every room, every cellar, every tunnel, before you can be assured that it truly is cleared of the enemy, and then it has to be secured. And it's that component that I know is the one that is I believe, going to have to be emphasized much more in the weeks that lie ahead, and then to try to get the people back into their homes, to once again to separate them from Hamas so that Hamas can truly be destroyed, but also prevented from reconstituting. Because you can see Hamas trying to reconstitute already, even in the north, where it has arguably been destroyed so far. So again, I think the IDF soldiers have done a magnificent job on the ground. There has to be much more, as I have described, but the key is, I believe, not to stopping until Hamas has been destroyed, rendered incapable of accomplishing its mission without reconstitution, and then a plan is implemented that keeps them from being able to reconstitute.
Thank you. Now, the timekeeping lady is waving at me, but I cannot let you go before asking you, as former head of the CIA, we seem to have a mindset issue with intelligence once every 50 years, 73, and then again this time. What would be your brief advice to intelligence organizations how to avoid what we call conception here, or mindset?
Well, we obviously learned the hard way as well on 9/11, and I think there's some similar factors here. some of this is, of course, working much harder to connect dots because we went back and we looked after 9/11. The intelligence was all there. We just hadn't put it together. We hadn't fused it. But the bigger issue, I think, is that there was a failure of imagination. There was an inability to imagine that people could actually do what happened on 9/11. And I would submit that that will be at least one of the factors that is identified as one of the failures in this particular case. My understanding is the intelligence was there. My understanding is that some of the lower level analysts actually did raise this up their chain of command within the intelligence structure, but it was dismissed because there was an inability to conceive that Hamas could carry out as sophisticated an attack as they actually did. And it was a very, very sophisticated attack at the end of the day. You know, expertly taking out the nodes by which all the video feeds go back to the rooms, the automatic machine guns all taken out by little small explosives going over the wire, through the wire, around the wire, everything else. To orchestrate all of this, this is not trivial. This is very, very, again, very sophisticated and really quite very operationally very advanced. And again, I think there was a dismissal of that, in addition to the sense, of course, that Hamas was becoming a, quote, responsible stakeholder and appreciating the additional worker visas and the inclination, of course, to split Hamas from the PA.
Right. Never confuse intentions with capabilities.
Exactly right. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
The privilege is mine, Ambassador, and great to be with you again. Thank you.